All right, so at this point we covered section one, this idea of the market revolution, and we learned a little bit about how technology and new inventions and the factories changed the way not only that we worked and produced things, but also it really had a huge effect on changing the way we lived our lives on a daily basis. This idea of going from being subsistence farmers producing goods so that we could consume them ourselves, to this idea of going to a workplace, a factory, working for a wage, producing goods that could be sold to get us money, so then we could use that money to purchase the goods that we needed to survive. That's a massive cultural shift that we went through as that market revolution was happening in the early 1800s. The rest of this chapter, we're going to change gears, but I want to at least make the connection between the two things, what we're going to be doing now and that first section about the market revolution. Really, as the market revolution took hold and became a thing, it almost created this need for us to expand. At first, just to expand our markets that we were, just to expand our economic outreach. But with that came the physical expansion of our country as well. And so for the rest of this chapter, we're going to be talking about that aspect of expansion westward. So we're going to be meeting a lot of different people, a lot of different groups of people, and we're going to be talking about the physical expansion of our country as we start to move westward. And it starts in section 2 here with this vocabulary term, probably the most significant term of the chapter, and that term is manifest destiny. You're going to hear me say this term over and over again. We're going to refer to it over and over again. And so we're going to start by simply writing down the definition. It says, the belief that America should and would spread our democracy, knowledge, economics, beliefs, etc., 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 from ocean to ocean, from sea to shining sea, from one end of the continent all the way across to the other end of the continent. Now, to us, that doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal because of the world, the America that we've always lived in. But when this idea first took hold in the 1830s, the 1840s, the United States looked quite a bit different. It was just the original 13 colonies and a handful of additional states that have been added afterwards, but basically nothing out west. So that's where we're headed, though, for the rest of this chapter. Okay, so this first slide, we're going to start with something that you've probably already learned about, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but it is a nice little review, and it's a good jumping off point for us to dive into this manifest destiny business, and that is to start with Lewis and Clark. I'm guessing that somewhere along the line you've learned about Lewis and Clark, you've learned about and are familiar with, or at least have heard the term, the Louisiana Purchase or the Louisiana Territory. Sometimes it's even called the Northwest Territory. Ultimately, what happens is this: the first real big piece of territory that the United States adds in its manifest destiny and its expansion westward was what was called the Louisiana Territory or the Louisiana Purchase. We purchased this massive chunk of territory from the French in 1804. Thomas Jefferson was the president at the time that brokered the deal. We get this smoking deal on this huge piece of land that nearly doubles the size of our country at the time. And when we did that, the idea was, okay, well, let's figure out what the heck is out there in that land. And so that's where Lewis and Clark come in. They go on a 2-year expedition, and they essentially go out into this new unsettled territory to try to bring back as much information as they possibly can about this piece of land that we just bought. So they make maps of the territory, maps of the mountains, the river systems. They bring back samples of the soils to see what kind of soils are out there, what grows in this territory. They brought back all kinds of information about the wildlife that they encountered. That meant bringing back actual living creatures that they caged up and brought back, but also they had artists that were drawing pictures of the flora and fauna, the animals that they encountered, the leaves and the trees and the plants. They also brought back information about the people that were living in this territory. We say it's unsettled, but it actually was not unsettled. There were Native Americans who had lived here at this point probably for thousands of years, and so they gathered information about the different tribes that they encountered, and they brought back that information as well. And in fact, probably the most famous person that is part of this Lewis and Clark expedition is one of those Native Americans that you've probably heard of. I'm hoping that you've all heard of Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a Shoshone Indian girl, and she was a girl. She was a teenager whenever she got involved with this expedition, and she ends up serving as a guide, a translator, and probably a wealth of other things to the expedition as they were exploring this new territory. Sacagawea, she ends up falling in love with one of the members of Lewis and Clark's team. She ends up getting pregnant on this expedition. She ends up delivering a baby while she is helping lead this expedition. And as I said, she was a teenager when all this was happening. Not a whole lot older than you guys. So a fascinating character. She's one of those people that I've always said I would love to just sit down and let her tell me the stories that she has from this expedition. So hopefully you've learned about her before, but if not, it might be something you want to look up and read a little more about. So what ends up happening after we get all this information back from the expedition is that it is decided that this massive chunk of territory out west it's not something that we need necessarily at this point. There's no real drive. Again, this is in 1804. Now this chapter really gets us further into the 1830s and 40s. So for the first couple decades that we purchased after we purchased Louisiana, it was just basically going to remain unsettled territory. We'll let the Native Americans live out there, many of whom had already migrated from the western or the eastern coast when we first originally settled here. And you know what? It'll work out. We'll let the Native Americans live out there in the Louisiana territory. The American settlers can live in peace back here. Everything's fine, right? But it doesn't take very long for that to change. Whoa, excuse me. It doesn't take very long for that to change. By the time we get into the 1830s, this idea of it just remaining unsettled Indian territory was out the window. We start to see many American settlers moving in that direction, not just into what was the Louisiana territory, but into Louisiana and beyond, into places like what eventually would be Oregon, into New Mexico, into parts of Mexico, into what is today California. And so that's where we're headed for the rest of the chapter. The Louisiana Purchase was just sort of the beginning of all this. In fact, it is at this point, by the 1830s, when American settlers start migrating in that direction. So you can see here on this map that I put up here, this is the United States as it existed before Louisiana, and then this green piece that is outlined here is the Louisiana territory. And you can see that literally nearly doubled the size of our country. And so as Americans started to move into this territory, they're going to go beyond it into Oregon, down into California, into Mexico, so on and so forth. So that's where we're headed. That's when Manifest Destiny becomes a thing. And I've just repeated the definition here. It's slightly different maybe than the way we had it on the first slide, but it says that Manifest Destiny was the belief that the United States had a mission to spread liberty from Atlantic to the Pacific. And this was a term that was coined by a writer in a magazine article at some point. His name was John L. O'Sullivan. And when he first used the term, it didn't take long for it to catch on, and Manifest Destiny became a thing. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time in this section just covering a few pieces of the puzzle, as I like to say, and that'll make more sense later. But we basically, Manifest Destiny is like this puzzle that we slowly piece together as we acquire more and more pieces of territory out west. And a lot of that has to do with the opening up of all of these different westward trails that help guide these American settlers into these different territories out west. One of which is the Santa Fe Trail. Just give you a couple little things about the Santa Fe Trail here. It was a 780-mile trail from Independence, Missouri, all the way westward into what at the time was Santa Fe, New Mexico. And at that point, when this trail first opened up, Santa Fe, New Mexico was still a part of Mexico. Again, that'll make a little bit more sense later as we get further into the chapter as well. But this becomes a popular trade route between the United States and now our neighbors to the south in Mexico. And so settlers and traders start going back and forth on trails like the Santa Fe Trail, and we start to see this connection with Mexico. But it doesn't stop there. Probably the most famous, and in some ways the most infamous trail westward, the one you've probably heard of before today, was the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail opens up, and settlers from the east start moving in that direction, and in this case they start heading into what it will eventually become Oregon. The story that unfolds as the Oregon Trail opens up is one of my favorites of westward expansion, and so that's what I'm going to share with you right now. The Oregon Territory at this point was this sparsely populated territory in the northwest corner of the continent, and there were very few people living there other than the natives who were living there, but it was also possessed by 4 separate nations. The United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Spain all had ties to this territory out in the middle of nowhere. Very few or none of these 4 countries had very many citizens living there, but they did have claims. Eventually, both the Russians and the Spanish will withdraw their claims for a number of different reasons, but that just leaves the United States and Great Britain sharing what was called the Oregon Territory. And in 1818, when it was just the United States and Great Britain, the 2 countries got together and said, hey, why don't we just agree to share it? And so they agree on what we would call joint occupation. There's nobody living there. There's no reason for us to fight over it. Let's just share it. But the Manifest Destiny thing throws a little wrench in that plan, because as American settlers start moving along this Oregon Trail that opens up, this 2,000-mile long trek over mountain ranges and across rivers from Missouri into this Oregon Territory, eventually something has to give, because as more and more Americans brave this rough, treacherous trail westward through Oregon, and if you've ever played the Oregon Trail game, which by the way is the very first video game that Mr. Weibel ever played in his life, of course the version that I played is nothing like the different ones that have been created since then. So if you've ever played any version of the game The Oregon Trail, you know that one of the things that is just consistent with that trip, and as you play the game, is that members of your party don't make it. It is because this was a treacherous trek along the Oregon Trail out west. The most famous group of settlers that traveled, and this is where the infamy part comes in, and they might be the most infamous group of settlers that traveled on the Oregon Trail, were the Donner Party. The Donner Party, long story short, gets trapped, lost, stranded in the woods, in the mountains. They end up getting snowed in whenever the weather changes, and they are lost in the mountains for a long time. They start to die. They're starting to lose their supplies, and eventually, what makes their story so infamous is that they resort to cannibalism. They end up starting that they have to survive by eating one another. As members of their party die, they eat the bodies to stay alive. So it's just one of it's the most famous, but it's just one example of the treacherous trip that all of these settlers were willing to risk, because they heard of all of these incredible stories about the paradise that was Oregon, all of the opportunities in the land and the beauty that was Oregon, and so thousands of Americans were willing to take this risk and head to Oregon. But that creates this problem with Great Britain. What ends up happening is, as more and more settlers start traveling along the Oregon Trail and start populating this territory of Oregon, the United States realizes we really can't just share this with Great Britain anymore. Something's got to give here. We've got a lot of American citizens now living there. They're building towns and communities and so on and so forth. And so in 1846, the United States and Great Britain signed a treaty. That treaty was to draw a line where we would separate the United States and Great Britain. At the time, Great Britain, England still owned and controlled what is today Canada. And so we end up drawing a line along the 49th parallel. That's one of those imaginary lines of latitude and longitude. You've probably learned about that in middle school. And it sounds very simple the way that I just put that, but it wasn't that simple, because there were a lot of people in the United States that wanted the line that we ended up drawing to divide where the United States would be below it and Great Britain would be above it. They wanted that line to be further north in Oregon, up into what is today Canada. There were a lot of people that wanted a larger piece of territory from the Brits. In fact, they wanted the line to be drawn at the 5440 parallel, which is further north than the 49th, and the phrase became 5440 or fight, 5440 or fight. Many Americans felt like we should go to war with Great Britain over this piece of land. Now, luckily, some cooler heads prevailed, and as I said, in 1846, we signed a treaty that would simply take the existing line. When we purchased Louisiana from the French, we had to establish a border in the north between us and Great Britain. And so what we decided to do in 1846 was take that old line where the Louisiana Purchase was and just keep it going all the way across to the Pacific Ocean. And that's what we have today, is the northern border of the United States. Luckily, the 49th parallel worked out, and we did not have to go to war with Great Britain. But just a fascinating piece of how Oregon became part of the United States. All right. Another trail that we're going to hit today that took settlers out west becomes known as the Mormon Trail. And obviously, this was another group of settlers that went west. This was the Mormons. Again, another fascinating story about westward expansion. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to do like the history of the Mormons in 3 minutes here, okay? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of the Mormon faith, how it came to be. I don't know if any of you are Mormons, in which case you may or may not know some of this history. And if you do know it, you may know this history better than I do even. This is just going to be sort of the tip of the iceberg, so we understand our purposes here for studying the Mormons, and that is why and how they ended up expanding westward. So let's start simply by looking at their history. All right, so the Mormon faith was founded in 1830, right? Yes, 1830, not too far away from here in upstate New York, when a young boy named Joseph Smith was out walking through the woods, and he had an angel appear to him and come to him. This angel comes to this young boy, Joseph Smith, and essentially basically says that he's a messenger from God, and that he is coming to tell Joseph Smith that he is the chosen one by God to spread the true word of God. That true word of God was given to Joseph Smith, as you can see here in the painting that was drawn to depict this, in the form of these golden tablets that had basically it would be the Book of Mormon, their Bible, all written down on these golden tablets. And essentially it was the Word of God and the rules for the faith and how this was going to work, and that Joseph Smith was chosen to spread this around the world. Well, Joseph Smith was a young kid. He was kind of freaked out by this whole situation, as I think any one of us would be if this happened to us, and so he didn't know what to do. He ends up burying these golden tablets and essentially kind of burying this whole situation. He doesn't tell anybody about it. He doesn't know how to deal with it until a few years later. He gets a little bit older, he gets a little bit more mature, and he realizes what his calling is and that he has to go out and do this. Unfortunately, in the meantime, the golden tablets where he had buried them were lost, and he was never able to retrieve them. But fortunately, he had written it all down on paper. So the Book of Mormon still does exist, and at that point, Joseph Smith started to go out and preach the word of the Mormon faith. One of the things that was a part of that faith was something called polygamy. Polygamy is the belief that well, it's not a belief, polygamy, it's a thing. It's when you have more than one spouse. Of course, in our culture, in our society in the United States, and especially in the other mainstream Christian religions that existed at the time, that was not acceptable. Not by the mainstream Christian religions, nor by the laws of our country, right? It was illegal to have more than one husband or wife, and that's still true today. So this one piece, and there were probably some other things about the Mormon faith that it just didn't sit well with mainstream America in New York when he was first preaching to people. And so he did gain some followers to join his faith, but this small group of Mormons was harassed, they were persecuted for their faith, and they were not accepted, and a lot of it had to do with this idea of polygamy. Well, Joseph Smith realizes, hey, this isn't working here in upstate New York. People aren't accepting us, we're being harassed, we're being persecuted. And so he takes this small group of Mormons that he had accumulated in New York, and they decide to move west. And now you start to see the connection with this, what we're studying in this chapter. They move first to Ohio, and they try to set up a community there and convert more people to join their faith. Same thing, they're harassed, they are persecuted, this idea of polygamy is not accepted, and so he moves further west into what was then at the time Illinois. And this is where things get really bad. In Illinois, still harassed, persecuted, not accepted. Joseph Smith and his brother are eventually kind of chased down by an angry mob of citizens in Illinois that didn't agree with what he was preaching. And essentially, they murder Joseph Smith and his brother. Obviously, this is sort of like turning it up a notch here. It's one thing to be persecuted, not accepted. But when Joseph Smith was murdered, another leader of the Mormon community, a guy named Brigham Young, sort of takes over the leadership role, and he says, we're getting out of here. And so that's when the Mormons start heading really west. They eventually travel along what becomes known as the Mormon Trail, and they end up in a place called Utah, what is today Utah. At the time, in 1844, when this happened, Utah was actually a part of Mexico. It was a northern territory in Mexico. That'll make sense as we continue further into the chapter. But they find this place that ends up becoming the capital of Utah today, Salt Lake City, where there's this massive lake surrounded by a ring of mountains, and there was nobody there. And Brigham Young and the Mormons decided this is the perfect place for us to settle down and make our community, essentially to live in peace without being harassed or persecuted by anybody. And so that's how eventually what we know today as the state of Utah and the city of Salt Lake City came to be. Eventually, Utah will become a territory after we have a war with Mexico. This is all sort of foreshadowing stuff we'll get to later. Brigham Young will be the first governor of that territory, and eventually in 1896, Utah will become the 45th state in the Union. So there we go, another fascinating story about another piece of the puzzle that was added when the Mormons traveled west to Utah. All right, now, I'm hoping that, just these two stories about Oregon and Utah kind of got you on the edge of your seat about this idea of manifest destiny, of expanding westward. There's a lot more where this came from. And if you think these stories aren't that fascinating for whatever reason, I don't know why you wouldn't think they weren't fascinating, then stay tuned, because we still have a war to fight with Mexico, and maybe that will pique your interest as we learn more about expansion westward and manifest destiny.